Wow! The people that persecuted many different cultures and cannabis, which is called dharma in another language, they will get their just what they deserve in the end. It is not end times. No one says this is a time when the world is going to be obliterated, or when 144,000 people are going to be saved off of this earth. Big mistranslations were made. 144,000 people? No, 144,000 days in a Baktoon. About 400 years, period. Ancient Sumerians count of kings? I suspect it's days, not years. Just like the older calendar, the Olmec, counted in days. Our grandparents were upset that they didn't get 10,000 years on the calendar, and they maybe even wanted 70,000 years on the calendar, counting straight, no negatives when you talk about history. But because of a cabal that says the earth is less than 7,000 years, that also preaches white supremacy, it seems, and also brainwashes people to believe flat earth. The world is in peril because Nazi Zionists are killing Semitic, Israelite descent people just because they identify as African, Arabian, or Palestinian. Africa is a continent. Arabia is a landmass. Palestinian means stone palace. All three of those terms do not say that those people are anti-Hebrew. All three of those terms include Hebrew, Israelite, Jews, Semitic descent people descended from Shem, which is Noah's son, claims so in the Bible. If that is real history, it's real history. And then the Zionists are murdering the Jews right now, as we speak, in Lebanon, in Syria, in the Gaza, in the West Bank, in the Congo with the Rapid Support Force, and etc., etc., etc. I could go on. But soon, Democracy Now! Is going to come on. It's October 31st. Halloween, Samhain. I'd not seen the movie Halloween until the same year I told my cousin this is when the real Halloween starts. 2019, Krampus, coal to the evil people. Coca-Cola Christmas? Santa Claus? That stuff is fake. Saint Nick was a brown man, not as dark in his complexion as me, but he wasn't Snow White. Coca-Cola is a fraud that helped change the date on the Christian calendar, advancing it by many years.
Did you know that CIUT FM's fall funding drive will be happening from November 18th to the 24th? Well, now you do. So, here is your chance to help us help you. With your support, we can continue to bring you great programming 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. So mark your calendars, November 18th to the 24th, and support CIUT FM's fall funding drive. The best sound in your city.
From the roots up, CIUT 89.5 FM, Toronto.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program, and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of CIUT FM.
From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Look, we know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election.
Before as many as 75,000 people, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke Tuesday night at the Ellipse in Washington, a week before Election Day. We'll go to the battleground state of Pennsylvania to speak with journalist Mark Lamont Hill. Then we'll look at how Republicans are blanketing the airwaves with transphobic ads ahead of Election Day. We'll speak to Amara Jones, host of the Anti-Trans Hate Machine podcast.
Paramilitary groups have seized upon anti-trans hate to solidify their alliance with supposedly mainstream conservatives. I'll show you how these attacks are part of a coordinated strategy to bring about a patriarchal fascist regime in America, one where queer people would be erased from public life.
All that and more coming up.
I call BS.
Welcome to Democracy
Lost
Now!
girls
DemocracyNow.org,
and boys
War and Peace
transported,
Report. I'm
taken,
Amy
trafficked
Goodman.
against their will.
Food
That
program
existed
is
before
calling for
1973
immediate
Common
action
Era.
to prevent
Enslavement
famine in
ended.
the Gaza Strip.
Trans-slave,
Warning Palestinians across the
transatlantic
besieged
slave
territory
trade,
are losing
lost
hope of
girls and
finding
boys.
any food for their starving children.
Transported,
The aid
trafficked,
agency said
taken
Tuesday it has nearly
into enslavement.
100,000 tons of food ready
LGBT,
for shipment from Egypt and
that's what it
Jordan,
originally
enough
stands
to
for.
feed 1 million Palestinians for 4 months. But that Israel has
And in
largely
America,
denied access to convoys.
we were matriarchal.
The situation is most
Not
dire
patriarchal.
in northern Gaza, where the Israeli army has
The chiefs were
blocked
females.
all aid access for a 25th consecutive day. This comes amidst dire warnings
Can't
from
give birth
aid
how you're a chief.
organizations over Israel's decision to ban the UN relief agency UNRWA. On Tuesday, the UN Humanitarian Office called the policy collective punishment a war crime, while UNICEF spokesperson James Elder warned of a complete collapse of Gaza's humanitarian system.
You take away the healthcare workers, you take away the nutritional support, you take away the people who will provide the life-saving supplies for a population that is physically, absolutely on death's door, and psychologically, of course, in uncharted territory. You take away these healthcare workers, you take away the nutritionists, then we will see many more children die.
On Tuesday, Israel's military once again bombed residential buildings in Beit Lahia, killing at least 19 Palestinians hours after a separate attack killed at least 93 people, including 25 children. Beit Lahia in northern Gaza has been declared a disaster area amidst weeks of relentless Israeli bombings and military siege. Meanwhile, a new report by the research group Forensic Architecture finds Israel is systematically committing crimes of persecution and destruction in Gaza, amounting to genocide. The group found Israel's destroyed over 83% of all plant life in Gaza, over 70% of agricultural land, nearly half of all groundwater wells, and 2/3 of water tanks. Of Gaza's 36 hospitals, Israel's forced 35 to stop service at least once, targeted 31 in bombings and attacks, and violently invaded 10 hospitals. In Lebanon, residents of the city of Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley rushed to flee their homes and businesses today after Israel's military ordered them to leave the city and surrounding villages. The panicked forced displacement came after 2 days of stepped-up attacks by Israel, killed at least 60 people in Baalbek. Lebanon's health ministry reports Israeli strikes on Tuesday killed at least 77 people across Lebanon. Among the dead are 10 people, mostly women and children, killed when Israel bombed a residential block in the town of Sarafat. In the occupied West Bank, lawyers for Marwan Barghouti say the longtime Palestinian political prisoner was assaulted by Israeli guards as he was held in solitary confinement. The beating in early September reportedly left Barghouti with numerous injuries to his upper body and a bloody ear that later became infected due to medical neglect. Barghouti's lawyers say he was previously subjected to at least 2 other attacks by Israeli prison guards. Marwan Barghouti is the most high-profile Palestinian in Israeli detention, who many have described as the Palestinian Nelson Mandela. Diplomats from Norway said Tuesday they're preparing a UN General Assembly resolution asking the International Court of Justice to rule on whether Israel's siege of the Gaza Strip violates international law. On Tuesday, U.S. envoy to the United Nations, Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, told the UN Security Council Israel must allow food, medicine, and other supplies into all of Gaza.
The United States has made clear to Prime Minister Netanyahu that 1 year into this conflict, Israel must address the catastrophic humanitarian crisis in Gaza. That the United States rejects any Israeli efforts to starve Palestinians in Jabalia or anywhere else. And that Israel's words must be matched by action on the ground.
Palestinian ambassador to the UN, Riyad Mansour, called on UN Security Council members to match their words with action, saying stop this genocide or forever remain silent.
The entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are at risk of imminent death, faced with the death penalty for refusing to leave their land.
Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces have committed staggering levels of sexual violence, raping civilians and kidnapping women as sex slaves, which may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's according to a new report by
Combat
a UN
field
fact-finding mission. Sudan's 18-month war between the RSF and Sudanese military has uprooted more than 14 million people, the world's largest displacement crisis. UN experts are calling on the International Criminal Court to expand its jurisdiction and investigate possible war crimes committed beyond the region of Darfur.
Yes,
a
please.
previous UN mission said both the RSF and Sudanese army may be guilty of atrocities committed during the conflict. This is Amy Pope, Director General of the International Organization for Migration, speaking from Port Sudan.
The situation here is simply catastrophic. There's no other way to put it. We're seeing hunger, disease, sexual violence. They're rampant. And for the people of Sudan, they're telling us it's really just a living nightmare.
In Mozambique, opposition leader Venancio Mondlane is calling on supporters to join him in another wave of protests in the capital Maputo following days of deadly clashes with police. Mozambique authorities have unleashed a brutal crackdown on protesters who've taken to the streets over allegations of fraud in the October 9th presidential and parliamentary elections, Mozambique's debt crisis, corruption, and other issues. Human Rights Watch reports Mozambique armed forces have killed at least 11 protesters, leaving dozens more injured. Here in the United States, Kamala Harris has delivered the last major speech of her campaign for the presidency. On Tuesday, the vice president rallied tens of thousands of supporters on the National Mall on the Ellipse for a closing argument in which she called herself a protector of U.S. democracy and warned of the threat of a second Trump term.
Those who came before us, the patriots at Normandy and Selma, Seneca Falls and Stonewall, on farmlands and factory floors. They did not struggle, sacrifice, and lay down their lives only to see us cede our fundamental freedoms. They didn't do that only to see us submit to the will of another petty tyrant.
Harris spoke from the Ellipse, the same venue where on January 6, 2021, Trump incited a mob of supporters to attack the Capitol to disrupt the certification of Joe Biden's Electoral College victory. Harris's campaign said 75,000 people attended Tuesday night's event, significantly larger than Trump's rally ahead of the insurrection. Donald Trump spent much of Tuesday seeking to control fallout from his racist Madison Square Garden rally Sunday, in which far-right so-called comic Tony Hinchcliffe called Puerto Rico a, quote, floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean, unquote. The New York Times described the rally as a closing carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism. On Tuesday, Trump called his Madison Square Garden rally a love fest.
There's never been an event so beautiful. It was like a love fest, an absolute love fest, and it was my honor to be involved.
Trump's former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, and former presidential opponent, who endorsed Trump at the Republican National Convention after unsuccessfully challenging him for the nomination, criticized Trump and the campaign for its attacks on Puerto Ricans and warned its overly masculine message is turning off women voters. Haley was speaking on Fox News.
They need to go and tell Puerto Ricans how much, they do value them. They need to tell Latinos that, but they also need to look at how they're talking about women. I mean, this bromance and this masculinity stuff, it borders on edgy to the point that it's going to make women uncomfortable.
Meanwhile, President Biden's clarified his remarks, condemning the racist comments made at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally. On Tuesday, Biden told Voto Latino, quote, "The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters," unquote. Trump's backers seized on the remarks, comparing them to Hillary Clinton's 2016 comment calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. On social media, President Biden wrote, quote, "His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. That's all I meant to say," he said. He said he was only talking about the people speaking at the Madison Square Garden rally. A group of 82 U.S. Nobel Prize winners have signed an open letter endorsing Kamala Harris for president, arguing a Trump presidency would, quote, "jeopardize any advancements in our standards of living, slow the progress of science and technology, and impede our responses to climate change," they wrote. Meanwhile, more than 1,000 religious leaders across the U.S. have offered a joint endorsement of Harris. Reverend Dr. Bernice King, daughter of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., said, quote, "Harris will provide us the opportunity to preserve our democracy and rule of law as we continue the people's fight to create a just, humane, and equitable society," unquote. Reverend King added, quote, "A vote for Kamala Harris is not an endorsement of U.S. funding for the war on Gaza," unquote. Meanwhile, Vermont Independent Senator Bernie Sanders has released a video urging supporters to vote for Harris in what he called the most consequential election in our lifetimes. Sanders cited Harris's positions on reproductive rights, wealth inequality, and the climate crisis.
And some of you are saying, how can I vote for Kamala Harris if she is supporting this terrible war? And that is a very fair question. And let me give you my best answer. And that is that even on this issue, Donald Trump and his right-wing friends are worse.
What?
President Trump's former top political
How can he be
advisor,
worse when he
Steve
says he
Bannon,
will
was
not send
released
them
from federal
weapons?
prison Tuesday after completing a
Are you saying
four-month
Donald
sentence
Trump
on
saying he
charges of
won't
contempt of
support the
Congress.
Zionists
In
killing
2022,
Israelites
a jury found Bannon
is wrong?
guilty of defying congressional subpoenas related
I
to
don't
the
get that.
January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection. Shortly after his release, Bannon held a news conference in New York City where he was
Kamala said she would
interrupted by
support
the comic Rob
the
Portallo,
Israelis
who
at all
disguised
costs.
himself as a MAGA
Trump said he's
supporter.
not going to send them weapons. That's the right thing to do. Don't send them weapons.
When's the next insurrection? And can we storm the Burger King after this?
Bannon still faces criminal charges in New York for allegedly defrauding donors to an anti-immigrant nonprofit called We Build the Wall, defrauding them out of more than $15 million and laundering the proceeds. That trial is set to begin December 9th. At least 51 people have been killed in regions across southern and eastern Spain, including the region of Valencia, after torrential rains triggered devastating floods, leaving entire roads and towns underwater. Officials said the death toll is likely to grow as search and rescue efforts continue. More than a month's worth of rain fell in less than 24 hours in some areas of southern and eastern Spain, with authorities saying this is one of the worst natural disasters to hit Spain in recent years. In India, air pollution around the national capital of Delhi has soared to 30 times the World Health Organization's recommended limit. Officials blame the worsening climate crisis paired with vehicle emissions and widespread crop stubble burning in neighboring states.
There's so much pollution in Delhi that we cannot even breathe properly. I've been ill for 4 days due to pollution. There is breathlessness and continuous coughing.
And more than 1/3 of the world's trees may be facing mass extinction due to deforestation and global heating from human activity. The findings were announced Monday at the United Nations Biodiversity Conference known as COP16, which is underway in Cali, Colombia. This is the first comprehensive assessment on the status of tree species published by the International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List, which warns more than 16 of the 47,000 tree species analyzed in the report are at risk of going extinct, threatening thousands of other species of plants, animals, and fungi that rely on forest ecosystems to survive. IUCN Director General Gretel Aguilar said in a statement, quote, "Trees are the barometer of life. Can you imagine a planet without trees? We humans are capable to reverse this and save these trees that we depend on. The task that we have is huge," they said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Coming up, before as many as 75,000 people, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke Tuesday night at the Ellipse in Washington, 1 week before Election Day. Stay with us. Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York. We're joined by Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
With the White House in the background, Vice President Kamala Harris addressed close to 75,000 supporters Tuesday at the Ellipse in Washington, D.C., in the largest rally of her presidential campaign. The campaign estimated that 75,000 people attended the outdoor rally, which took place at the same spot where Donald Trump spoke January 6, 2021, ahead of the Capitol insurrection.
But voters are still considering who to vote for, or whether you'll vote at all. So tonight, I will speak to everyone about the choice and the stakes in this election. Look, we know who Donald Trump is. He is the person who stood at this very spot nearly 4 years ago and sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol to overturn the will of the people in a free and fair election. An election that he knew he lost. Americans died as a result of that attack. 140 law enforcement officers were injured because of that attack. And while Donald Trump sat in the White House watching as the violence unfolded on television, he was told by his staff that the mob wanted to kill his own vice president. And Donald Trump responded with 2 words: so what? America, that's who Donald Trump is. And that's who is asking you to give him another 4 years in the Oval Office.
Like it never went on. Kamala Harris went on to describe Donald Trump as a petty tyrant who is, quote, consumed with grievance and out for unchecked power. While she spoke, hundreds of protesters gathered to call for a U.S. arms embargo on Israel. Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink, was removed from Harris's rally, along with others.
So they're dragging us out while Kamala Harris is talking, and they're acting like everything is normal. So great. And here she is, part of an administration that has been sending weapons every day to slaughter the children in Gaza, to destroy Lebanon, and now threatening a war with Iran. This is not okay. There is a genocide going on. Wake up. Wake up.
Kamala Harris's rally in Washington, D.C. on the Ellipse came 2 days after Donald Trump held his major rally in Madison Square Garden here in New York, described by the New York Times as a closing carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism. One speaker called Harris the Antichrist. Another described Puerto Rico as a, quote, floating island of garbage. On Tuesday, Donald Trump spoke at Mar-a-Lago, attempting to put a different spin on the event.
I don't think anybody has ever seen anything like what happened the other night at Madison Square Garden. The love in that room, it was breathtaking, and you could have filled it many, many times with the people that were unable to get in. But politicians that have been doing this for a long time, 30 and 40 years, said there's never been an event so beautiful. It was like a love fest. An absolute love fest, and it was my honor to be involved.
Donald Trump later campaigned in Allentown, Pennsylvania, a majority Latinx city, home to 34,000 Puerto Ricans, really one of the hearts of Puerto Rican Pennsylvania, where he was met with protests. Overall, Pennsylvania is home to over 450,000 Puerto Ricans.
We're setting every record. Hispanics, Latinos, nobody loves our Latino community and our Puerto Rican community more than I do. You know, it's interesting because I've done more for Puerto Rico than any president, by far, nobody close.
With the presidential election less than a week away, we're joined in Philadelphia by Mark Lamont Hill, host of Up Front on Al Jazeera English and a nightly YouTube show called Night School. He's the co-author of Except for Palestine, The Limits of Progressive Politics, and author of the book We Still Here, Pandemic, Policing, Protest, and Possibility. Mark, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why don't you start off by responding to this really epic event last night? I mean, there was the presidential candidate, Vice President Kamala Harris, speaking on the Ellipse where President Trump spoke January 6, 2021. She spoke in front of 75,000 people. Talk about what she said and didn't say.
and it's good to be here, Amy. Thank you for having me back. It was a really epic event in lots of ways. The size and the scale of the event was extraordinary. Donald Trump has campaigned and bragged about the size of his rallies. He's used the size of his rallies in a really disturbing way to be an index of his popularity, his electability, and a kind of mandate that he has, despite losing the last election by a lot of votes. So to see Kamala Harris there certainly showed that she's not losing steam. And she made a final case to the American people, and she made the best case that a liberal Democrat can make, which is Donald Trump is worse. Whatever critiques you have of her, she pointed out that democracy might be imperiled by his re-election. She pointed to January 6th, not just that it happened, but that he sort of underwrote it, that he animated it, that he inspired it, his cruel indifference to Mike Pence. But she didn't just talk about January 6th. She talked about the potential impact of a Trump presidency on everyday working people, the increasing taxes on imports, cutting taxes on billionaires. She did a solid job of pointing out all of the ways that Donald Trump is a threat, all of the ways that women's reproductive health, reproductive freedom, access to IVF. She went through all the things where Donald Trump is legitimately a worse choice. And for many people out there, particularly this audience, who may be saying, look, I hate both of these corporate candidates. I don't want either of them. I'm disturbed by them. She sort of made a case for why you might want to think of Trump. The problem is what you asked me about, secondly, which is what she left out. She didn't talk about, for example, what's going on in Lebanon. She didn't talk about what's going on in Gaza. And the reason she didn't talk about that is because she can't make a credible case in that area for how she's any different than Donald Trump. I disagree very strongly with Senator Bernie Sanders, who says even on Gaza, Trump is worse. Trump is awful on Gaza. He was awful 4 years ago, awful 8 years ago. He cut UNRWA. He did all the things long before October 7th. But there's no credible case in the midst of a genocide that he would be worse. And if so, it's a distinction without a difference. I mean, it's somewhat absurd to say, yeah, I have helped underwrite and fund. I've been part of an administration that has pushed forward one of the worst atrocities in modern history, but the other guy may have gotten even more people killed. I mean, it's a terrible argument. So at the end of the day, what we saw from Kamala Harris speaks for itself, but so does what Donald Trump did. When you go to his rallies and you hear the xenophobia, the racism, the calls to violence, the implicit calls to violence, that is, and even the so-called love fest that he depicted was a love fest among xenophobes and racists. It's a white supremacist love fest. So at the end of the day, whatever decision voters make, they have to be very clear here that if you vote Donald Trump, you are voting for a reenactment of a very, very, very dangerous moment in American history.
And Mark, I wanted to ask you, Vice President Harris was in Philadelphia last weekend attending church and later visiting a barbershop to meet with African-American men. And there's been a lot of focus on the supposed shift, especially of black male voters and Latino males toward Trump. But there's a recent ABC Ipsos poll that comes out that essentially says that this isn't happening, that basically that there's still sort of the same historic pattern among both African Americans and Latinos in terms of support for a Democratic candidate. I'm wondering your thoughts about this.
Well, yeah, absolutely. First of all, these polls historically have done a very poor job of assessing the voting patterns and predicting the voting outcomes of black people, poor people, and other people who are outside of the margin or on the margins of mainstream America. But the idea that 30% of black men were going to vote Trump, 27% of black men were going to vote Trump, was always absurd. And many black journalists, many black social scientists, many black political scientists in particular, always said that. And as the number drops from 27 to 21, you're going to see it come down to earth. And it's going to be far closer, as you pointed out, to the traditional numbers. Now, might it go up 3, 4, 5%? Absolutely. It might be a little bit higher. I suspect it will be. But it won't be anywhere near the astronomical numbers that have been predicted. And I think that's problematic to suggest for a couple reasons. One, there was a kind of panic around it that suggested that black men were these weird, pathological, incomparably patriarchal people who were going to vote against Kamala Harris and vote for Trump because we were these awful people. And I think that's chastising black men rather than appealing to them at the policy level first. But it also suggests somehow that Democrats are entitled to black votes. So why aren't these black men being good to the party? Why are they abandoning the party? Why aren't they doing what they're supposed to do when, in fact, black men have been the second most loyal people to the Democratic Party? If anything, they've been too loyal. Again, I'm not suggesting that people should vote for Trump. To be clear, never vote for Trump. But I am saying that there has to be a different kind of conversation and one that finally implicates white people. Democratic presidents don't win because they get the majority of white people. A Democratic president hasn't gotten the majority of white voters in a very, very long time. I mean, decades and decades and decades. Trump does not win because only 90% of black men voted or only 88% of black men voted. Donald Trump wins because white people choose whiteness. Donald Trump will win this election because white people have chosen to close ranks around their whiteness rather than their political interests. When the poor white farmer or the person who's been pushed out of the labor market decides that they're going to vote for Trump and his billionaire tax breaks, when they decide that they're going to respond to xenophobia by opting in, when white women hear Donald Trump's patriarchy and the vile things he says and still decide to vote for him, they're the ones that are choosing whiteness. They're the ones that are choosing Trump. So please, for black people who have always attempted to hold this fragmented democracy together, whatever happens in this election, if Donald Trump wins, it ain't because of us.
And one sector of the electorate that's gotten very little attention are Asian Americans, who in 2020 voted 54% for Biden. But the indications are from those polls that have specifically centered in on the millions of Asian Americans in the country, that there's a much bigger margin, about 66 to 28% among Asian American and Pacific Islanders for Kamala Harris. I'm wondering your thoughts about how Asian Americans rarely get talked about.
Yeah, I think you're right. Asian American voters rarely get talked about, and when they do, they get talked about in the aggregate, kind of like we're doing right now. I mean, to think about what Korean American voters want or Japanese American voters want is very different than to think about what, say, Hmong American voters might want. And when you're in a place like Wisconsin, if you're in Milwaukee or you're in Madison, where there are Hmong populations, where there are Cambodian populations, like there are in, say, South Philadelphia, you got to say, okay, how can we reach these voters? How can we understand their needs, their economic plights, their social trajectories? They're all very different, but very often when we say Asian, we're lumping in a whole lot of people who have different ideologies, beliefs, etc. We sometimes do that with Latinx voters as well, but I think we do it even more so with Asian American voters, and I think that's why many politicians, not just at the national level, but at the local level, miss the mark.
I want to go to President Biden's comments facing criticism after speaking during a Vote a Latino Get Out the Vote call online, condemning racist comments made about Puerto Rico at Trump's Madison Square Garden rally.
Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico where I'm in my home state of Delaware, they're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of things is unconscionable. And it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done.
Now, Trump and his backers seized on Biden's remarks, comparing them to Hillary Clinton in 2016, calling Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. On social media, President Biden clarified, he said his demonization, this is what Biden said, referring to Trump, his demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. That's all I meant to say. The Biden team went on to say he was talking about the supporters who spoke at the Madison Square Garden rally. But Mark Lamont Hill, if you can respond to this, you are in Philadelphia. You're in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. There is this question and a whole controversy that is swirling about in the Kamala Harris campaign, which is what to do with Biden over these last few days. He is, quote, misspeaking a lot. They're going to send him to Scranton, of course, his hometown, where he can appeal to white, blue-collar workers. But they are concerned about his gaffes, and that we in the media are even talking about this when she has 75,000 people at her closing argument address. Talk about the importance of Pennsylvania and also Biden's role in all of this, including what's happening in Gaza.
Yeah, first, Pennsylvania absolutely is of the utmost importance. We saw that both in 2016 and in 2020. I'm not sure that either candidate or either campaign is comfortable that they can win this election if they don't send him to Scranton because he has a huge margin of error in his hometown. Other than that, I think the Harris campaign would be very wise to leave Joe Biden off of the campaign trail. He was someone who was gaffe prone in his prime, but at this moment, the very reason why he's not the nominee is the reason why he should be on the campaign trail, and that is I'm not sure he's up for the challenge. Many people are at his age. Many people are at this level of his career in terms of being, sort of emeritus level presidents. They should be on the campaign trail, but Joe Biden is in a unique position. I think that he, after taking the victory lap this summer, should step to the side and allow Kamala Harris to move forward. Also, any critiques of Joe Biden at this moment don't need to be assigned to Kamala Harris. She's already been subjected to sufficient scrutiny. I don't think bringing Joe Biden on helps at all. And then for those people who are attempting to convince themselves that Kamala Harris is different than Joe Biden on some key policy issues, particularly foreign policy issues, I don't think bringing Genocide Joe back out in the midst of an ongoing war and an escalation in Lebanon is something that will do well for voters. Again, that's not to suggest that they're different than each other, but if I'm a campaign strategist, I don't want to remind people of their similarities.
And Mark, I wanted to ask you about the day after Election Day next week, because back in the last presidential election, a year before the election, I warned on this show that my sense was that the Trump people were not going to accept whatever happened that was not in his favor, and that there was a real danger of violence and insurrection. But my sense is that this time, it's very likely that we're not going to know for days what the final results are, and whatever it is that the Trump people are not going to accept it. Except this time, I believe what's going to happen is more localized insurrections in county election boards and at the state level, as the Trump MAGA movement have learned from their failures last time around. I'm wondering if you have a sense whether the progressive or even the traditional Democrats are really prepared for the kind of resistance that they're going to encounter from Trump's followers.
Yeah, I mean, first, yes, I think all that's going to happen. These are deplorable people. Anyone in 2024 that is willing to vote for Donald Trump is deplorable, and it's a morally indefensible position. And that claim that I'm making is supported by the extraordinary amount of violence that is being promised to be doled out all throughout the country if former President Trump becomes a new re-elected President Trump. That is a very, very dangerous proposition. When you look at social media, when you look at the sort of underground worlds where these people often circulate, there are extraordinary promises of violence. And because Donald Trump never just stands up and says, hey, I hope that doesn't happen. I need this not to happen. I demand that it does not happen. Because he doesn't do that. He gives license to these people to make it happen. But I don't think that this is just the problem of liberal Democrats or traditional Democrats or progressives or anybody else. This is the problem of anyone who believes in freedom. Anyone who believes in safety and dignity should be fighting this, should be preventing this. And every one of us should be scared, because as we saw, even people who carry the water for Donald Trump for 4 years, as Mike Pence did, and again, one of the most morally repugnant vice presidencies we could imagine simply for being next to Trump, even though he did all that water carrying, he was disposable to Donald Trump. Donald Trump will allow anyone to fall by the wayside if it benefits him. So no one is safe in a Trump presidency. No one is safe the day after a Trump loss. And I think we need to be very mindful of that and guard ourselves against it. And the very fact that we have to ask ourselves, are we safe if Trump loses? When was the last time there was a presidential contest that did not include Donald Trump? We were literally worried about the status of democracy or the safety of everyday people based on the winner or the loser of the election. We cause a lot of violence around the world, but we've never had to deal with that at home in the same way. We should be accountable for both. But my point here is, at the end of the day, only Donald Trump brings that kind of craziness, and it's a signpost of why maybe, just maybe, he shouldn't be leading the country.
Just to talk about the survey that Brennan just did, the Brennan Center, a survey of local election officials across the U.S. found 38% report experiencing threats, harassment, or abuse. 54% are concerned about the safety of their colleagues, according to this report released by the Brennan Center for Justice. The survey of more than 925 local election officials in February and March also found 62% are concerned about political leaders attempting to interfere with how election officials do their jobs. 13% of local officials who responded said they're concerned about facing pressure to certify results in favor of a specific candidate or party. Mark Lamont Hill, we want to thank you for being with us. We hope you'll join us for our election night special, which is on Tuesday night at democracynow.org or on your favorite public television or community radio station. We'll be broadcasting from 8 p.m. Eastern to midnight, and the next morning from 8 in the morning Eastern to 10, a 2-hour special on November 6th. Mark Lamont Hill, host of Upfront on Al Jazeera English, and a nightly YouTube show called Night School, also professor of anthropology and urban education at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Coming up, we look at how Republicans are blanketing the airwaves with transphobic ads ahead of Election Day. If people are watching sports, baseball or football, the Republicans are spending tens of millions of dollars in anti-trans ads. We'll speak to Amara Jones, host of the Anti-Trans Hate Machine podcast. Stay with us.
Across the Americas, no such thing as transgenderism existed before Columbus and the Latin conquest brutalized the Americas, and our people were sexually assaulted by people that ran the enslavement farm plantations, sugarcane plantation. The eunuch came from across the sea, and that is unscientific to castrate someone's genitalia for any reason. Lost girls and boys transported, trafficked, taken against their will and the will of their families. 1973, Common Era and before, united against predators, colonizers, and settlers that are executing the document of discovery. That's the trans we're on. Our astronomy transit event got canceled by the pushers of sexual influence.
I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We look now at how Republicans are spending tens of millions of dollars, something like over $60 million, to flood the airwaves and social media with political ads that attack transgender rights. The Trump campaign is running the first ever presidential campaign ad on the topic, and the Senate Leadership Fund, backed by Mitch McConnell, is running ads in key Senate races in swing states, often during major football games.
Kamala was the first to help pay for a prisoner's sex change. The power that I had, I used it in a way that was about pushing for the movement, frankly, and the agenda. Kamala's agenda is they, them, not you.
But Brown voted multiple times to allow transgender biological males to participate in girls' sports.
No!
Supported providing puberty blockers and sex change surgeries to minor children. She even supports forcing Wisconsin women's domestic violence shelters to admit
Males only in male sports and females only in female sports, unless the females are too strong and they're able to compete with males.
Trump's message. Some say it's his closing message at a Bronx barbershop campaign.
If a male is too weak, they have to get permission from the females to be in the female sport.
Trans kids when asked how he would improve schools.
I say reading, writing, and arithmetic. No transgender, no operations. You know, they take your kid. There are some places. Your boy leaves for school, comes back, a girl. Okay?
They tried to do that to us in the 70s.
What is that all about?
For more we're joined by Amara Jones, founder and CEO of Translash Media, host of its investigative podcast,
Probably funded by the Zionists.
Machine, which just launched a new season about how paramilitary groups have weaponized transphobia to forge ties to Republicans and stoke political violence. Amara Jones' new piece for Newsweek is headlined, "What's at Stake for Trans People in This Election?" in national, state, and local races. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Amara. So if you could talk about the overall climate, I mean, I listened to almost every speech on Sunday at Madison Square Garden. Almost every speaker, including Robert F. Kennedy, talked about trans issues. I think his line was, "We're going to protect women's sports." But if you can talk about the overall climate, the tens of millions of dollars being put into ads.
Oh, I'm sorry that you did that to yourself, Amy, and watched for 6 hours. I think that what we have to be very clear about is that transphobia is not just a plank, but a key pillar of the Republican Party. It has staked a large part of its argument as to why it should be in power and why it should return to power due to transphobia and due to its campaign against trans people. It's sort of that and immigration are essentially the reasons why they say that they should be reelected. And I think that for them, anti-trans hate does a couple of things. I think the first thing that it does is that it helps them continue to animate their base and to essentially give them something to focus on after abortion. For several years, they've known that abortion was going to be on the chopping block and that they had a key part of their constituency that was engaged on gender, and so they have to give that group of people something to do, essentially. Secondly, it allows them to have inroads into places and people that they would never be in conversation with. They normally wouldn't be in conversation with suburban moms who they had been turned off to. They wouldn't be able to be in conversation with certain black religious people and Latinos who are evangelicals, or even some gay people, right, who are anti-trans, the so-called TERFs. So what this does is that it allows them to be able to shave off just enough votes in marginal races to eke out a win. And that's what they look at this issue as. And I think the fact that they've dropped so much money on these ads tells us that they believe that this race is extremely close or they're behind. And so what they're trying to do is to pick up 1 or 2 votes per precinct in order to win, which was Donald Trump's margin over Hillary Clinton in Michigan in 2016, for example. And the last thing that it does for them is that it cements them as a Christian nationalist party. It is the imprimatur of the fact that the Republican Party has become an extremist movement that has been taken over by the Christian nationalist movement and brands them as such and puts them in league not only with political extremists, but also paramilitary extremists in a bid to destabilize democracy from the ground up.
Amara, I wanted to ask you, the Wall Street Journal's editorial board recently ran a piece titled Transgender Sports is a 2024 Sleeper Issue. And they especially focused on Senate races in Ohio, Montana, and Wisconsin. I'm wondering your response and why particularly these states that they're focusing on?
Well, those states are Republican-leading states where the Senate candidates in those states have to rely on a lot of Republican votes or independent voters who lean Republican in order to be able to win. Those are also all tight races, right? Which is where you want to deploy, from their perspective, anti-trans issues and anti-trans hate or discomfort at a minimum. And so it is a part of that strategy of eking out votes, getting just enough, and playing to Republicans and reminding them that the candidates that they might be inclined to vote for in this race, might be strange or somehow anti-American or in some ways just weird people, to turn the phrase back on Democrats. So it's an otherization that's happening with this issue, and again, it's in these tight Senate races where these Democrats have to rely on Republican votes. And the Republican Party, in a really short amount of time has primed its entire base to be concerned and to be focused on anti-trans issues. So they're ripe for it. In the last 4 years, they have passed anti-trans laws in half of the country. And just this year, 600 anti-trans bills have been introduced, becoming more extreme each year. So this is just something that Republican voters are naturally inclined to focus on. And so if you're in a tight race and you have to rely on some Republican votes, and as a Republican you see that the Democrat is doing that and maybe making inroads, then you want to deploy this issue as a way to bring those voters back home.
And you've also looked into how paramilitary groups have used anti-trans politics to forge closer ties to Republicans. Could you talk about what you found?
So essentially, anti-trans issues acts as an affinity point between paramilitary groups and the Republican Party. And one of the things that happened after January 6th is that these paramilitary groups saw that if you do one big thing against the national government deploys its power. But what these groups decided to do was to atomize themselves, to go local, in the words of Gavin McGinnis, who told me in an interview that that was their strategy.
The founder of Proud Boys.
The founder of Proud Boys. And what he was alluding to is the fact that these groups have kept their members engaged, recruited new members, forged relationships with local politicians, Republican politicians all across the country, and continue to develop their brand by focusing on drag story hours and protesting LGBTQ events across the country. And so it seemed as if the Proud Boys and the other groups had gone away, but all they've done is gone to ground. And because they focused on LGBTQ issues, local authorities and other politicians and even the mainstream media have ignored their continued development and growing strength because they see, they're just protesting, drag story hours. But what they've been doing is exercising themselves and getting ready for sort of the next big events. And one of the things that we need to focus on is that SPLC last year, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremist and extremist groups, last year did a study. And in that study, they counted more extremist groups in the United States than ever, than since they've been counting. And half of white supremacist groups, half of those groups last year engaged in anti-LGBTQ and anti-trans actions and protests and some form of violence. So these groups have used these issues in order to grow strength below the radar for whatever comes next.
I wanted to turn to the trailer for season 3 of your podcast, Translash's Anti-Trans Hate Machine. It follows up on this point. Paramilitary groups stoke political violence.
Hi, I'm Amari Jones. I've spent years investigating authoritarian and far-right movements, and lately I've been alarmed by the rise in dangerous political violence across the United States. It's at levels not seen since the 1970s, and an unprecedented amount of this violence is being directed at queer and trans people.
Drag queen story time interrupted at an East Bay library. A hate crime investigation now underway.
So on this season of the Anti-Trans Hate Machine, I'm going to show how the anti-trans ecosystem has expanded its fight from legislatures and courtrooms to the streets, and what this means for all of us.
Everybody was armed that day. Everybody was carrying sidearms. Everybody had knives on display. Everybody was putting their hands on their pistol grips.
Paramilitary groups have seized upon anti-trans hate to solidify their alliance with supposedly mainstream conservatives. I'll show you how these attacks are part of a coordinated strategy to bring about a patriarchal fascist regime in America, one where queer people would be erased from public life.
If the bullets start flying, I'm covering her up.
Funny.
And I'm taking the bullet for her, and she'll survive. So she has to be with me.
So that's the trailer for the new season 3 of Anti-Trans Hate Machine. You talk about a lot of
anti-trans, They know nothing about anti-trans.
Using the state as a testing ground for a new wave of extremism. Episode 3, No Such Thing as a Lone Wolf, looks at the responses and solutions to terrorist violence fueled by anti-trans hate. You're looking at Wadsworth, Ohio. Tell us some specific stories and also how they relate to down-ballot races.
So, one of the things that's happening in Ohio, in Idaho, there's so many examples, but in Idaho is the fact that extremist groups, paramilitary groups, have found common cause with an organization called the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And the Idaho Freedom Foundation acts as sort of this connective tissue between paramilitary groups, extremist politicians, and the promulgation of laws to make the state more extreme. And essentially what they are all doing is working to create an atmosphere of fear and intimidation at the local level, transforming what was once a right-leaning, mainstream, in quotes, Republican Party into one dominated by people who want to do things or are promoting to do things like make paramilitary groups legal in the state, to literally legalize them. And this air of intimidation means that people who are considering running for races, who may not be extremist politicians, come under threats. People who put LGBTQ signs or pro anything other than, what Christian nationalists want in their yards. One person drove up to a person that we interviewed and told her when she put an LGBTQ sign in her yard, thanks for putting that sign in your yard because we know where to shoot when the bullets fly. And so what this is doing is using the paramilitary groups as a way of shifting the comfort level with democracy, with making your voice heard at the democratic level, and therefore getting more and more extreme politicians there. And they're working and also signaling with places like Libs of TikTok, which put out a call around an LGBTQ event in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and that event in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho drew in Patriot Front, who was there to stop violence that day, as a part of what an Idaho Freedom Foundation politician had called for in terms of protesting that event. And the problem with Idaho is that it's a petri dish for these conditions, where we are starting to see it occur in other places like Tennessee, where Patriot Front is beginning to make more and more of a show of force. It's passed more anti-trans laws than any other state in the country. And so what we're seeing is this affinity. I mean, even in places like New York City, where the Proud Boys are increasingly allying with certain, believe it or not, Republican members of the city council around Drag Story Hour events here. So what is happening is that being anti-trans is a signal for extremists as to who's on their side, and that signal then allows them to work together to push the country more and more to its extremes.
And Mara, I wanted to ask you, there's been a lot of attention focused on Project 2025 by the Democrats, but could you talk about the central place that anti-trans ideology plays in Project 2025?
Well, you can't understand Project 2025 without understanding or grasping the Republican Party's obsession with trans people and with transphobia. As a matter of fact, anti-trans sentiment and anti-trans, ideas are on page 1 of Project 2025, going into page 2. It's literally on the first page. And essentially, Project 2025, with its weaponization of government, is essentially taking all of the learnings that the Trump administration garnered from its anti-trans policies, where it learned how to weaponize the government against a group of people in healthcare, in the military, in education, attempted in housing, and essentially then took those learnings and then applied them to Project 2025. As a matter of fact, one of the key architects of Trump's anti-trans policies, Roger Severino, is one of the key people who drafted and wrote Project 2025. And to close the loop, he and other people were at the Heritage Foundation, came into the Trump administration with these policies, and are now carrying them through, applying
identifying them to many people through Project 2025.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us. Also, this is a case we'll look at in the coming days. The Supreme Court will soon hear a landmark legal challenge brought by the ACLU against a ban on hormone therapies for transgender youth. It will be argued by Chase Strangio, making Chase Strangio the first openly transgender lawyer to argue before the Supreme Court. Amara Jones, thanks so much for being with us. Founder and CEO of Translash Media, host of its investigative podcast, The Anti-Trans Hate Machine. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Take 4. 1, 2, 3.
Did you know that CIUT FM's full funding drive will be happening from November 18th to the 24th? Well, now you do. So, here is your chance to help us help you. With your support, we can continue to bring you great programming.
I am just posting my post here since they stopped my timer rolling, and I'm not live on
From the roots up, CIUT 89.5 FM, Toronto.
I'm just typing out here before I get to my comments. Okay, I'm gonna read what I wrote here. Since they were talking, trans in legal jargon means transport or transit. That I have written right here. In legal status with police, it also means transient, which means homeless, houseless, missing people, lost, girls, boys, transported, trafficked, taken quietly, against their will from their family and themselves. Anti-trans means anti-kidnap. Anti-people being transient. We don't want any being homeless. We don't want any transient youth. There's a difference between someone roaming, being nomadic, and actually being homeless, transient. Cancel culture. The people pushing the transgender agenda are trying to cancel American culture. According to our grandparents, that stuff did not exist in the Americas. Humans are biological. Bi meaning two genders, male and female. It takes a male and a female to make the next generation. English is my 6th or 7th language. I went to school with all people that were taking ESL, English as a second language. Many of them abused and brutalized American Indians, or Asians, or Africans, or Australians. Came here and have been here longer than the people that came here since 1984. Astronomy transphobia. Astronomy transit phobia. Every day, the news says don't look up at the sun. Every day, the news does not talk about space weather. Every time there's an eclipse, I hear the news say do not look at the eclipse. You cannot look at the sun. You know how much BS, anti-scientific, non-scientific, unobservational things I've heard about astronomy? Astronomy is the most fear-mongered science there is. I am surprised to find out recently that if a male could read, they're seen as nice and acceptable or higher on the list. But if a male is interested in astronomy, they're down low on the list? Do you not understand how difficult astronomy is? You have to master math, cartography, science to understand astronomy. That means you have to read and understand what you're reading. Now, I could understand when someone's learning a language, they can't speak it well, like me. Plus, when I don't have the proper medication in me, I can't speak well, so I can't read well. That does not mean I'm stupid, like people used to spread the rumor. Just because our family's peace pipe was spiked by the Virginian people that push white supremacy, and we were in a drunken stupor in the 1980s, does not mean our family is stupid. When the news media says they do not look at the sun during an eclipse, that is based on phobia of astronomy, transits, and possibility of meteor impacts, what NASA calls space invaders. Have you ever played the earliest video games? They are about pilots shooting down asteroids or other non-intelligent objects falling to Earth, like the game Acronoid, Gyros, etc. Most of the earliest video games that were created were about pilots shooting possible things going to hit the Earth's surface out of the atmosphere before it hits the ground. 1973, Common Era, Roots Canada, 1973 and before. Lost girls, boys transported quietly against their will. Lost girls, boys transported. Lesbos was an all-girls school island. Gay/gay, two different spellings and means two in Ojibwe, while gay in proper English means happy from the Sanskrit word for happy. Gay. In Mandarin, gay means change or gift depending on the pronunciation. Just like my cousin used to say in the early 90s, when I had totally forgot after 20 years passing by that LGBT means lost girls and boys transported and is related to the transatlantic slave trade. He was telling me, no, it does not mean lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. You're around sexual influencers trying to influence you the last 10 years. And he told me back then in the early 90s, somewhere between 1990 and 1992, that LGBT originally means lost girls, boys transported. And the people are freaking twisting your mind with this new meaning, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So when we realize the girls that are older than me, that hail from Guyana, which means they might have been some of the people that were sexually assaulted along with us, guy on their knees that got brutalized in the 70s. We hail from different countries because people came here and brutalized us. Yahoos with satanic desires came here and brutalized us. The Satan Yahoos came here and brutalized us first before they're doing what they're doing in Palestine right now. So when we say anti-trans, that know the policies and know what's going on, it means we are against the transatlantic slave trade, transporting people illegally across to do forced work and labor. We do not like homelessness. We do not like children being kicked out of their house or being forced out of their house by violence and being transient on the street. We do not like little kids being picked up on the street by old men, transported places they don't know and sexually assaulted. That's the anti-trans we are on. I am not white. United States considers me black. I'm American Indian. Labeled black by United States of America. United States of America has a sexual problem. The immortal sex cults, Nazis and Zionists run the United States of America, using the news media to twist reality to blame other people for their stuff. You can't blame Germany for where white supremacy started and the brutality. It started white Yankees. Hitler got his things from reading about United States white Yankee, how they treated people in America. How the Dutch and Frenchmen treated people in America, our peoples. There's a reason why in the United States of America, Métis is not recognized as a tribe. They are influences to push French as a language in Canada. If Queen Elizabeth wasn't deceived by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which probably might have no American Indian blood, right now in Canada, all indigenous languages would have been status. And I tell you, French would have only been status in Quebec. If Queen Elizabeth wasn't tricked by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, indigenous American languages would have had status in Canada between 1982 and 1984, Common Era. 42 years of forced English because of the United States and their coup against America, pushing English as a second language worldwide to change the narrative of history to the date they say, 2024 Common Era. If people were talking about William Shakespeare being alive in his 70s and he was really alive and that was really him, and I remember being there when people translated the Bible into modern English, if what I remember is true and I'm 56 years old, just like all the older people that remember me being a toddler, what year is it really? Anno Domini's. The 1700s or the 1800s? Adam Weishaupt is a spy from Europe that is the image of George Washington on the dollar bill. Jeffrey Epstein, Thomas Jefferson. So if a lot of people can remember that are older than me, it went from being wild, wild west where there was only horses and carriages. I'm 56, and they can remember that, just like I can. My ID says I'm younger, because the predators wanted me to believe I was immortal over 7,000 years old while telling my uncle he's 2,000 years old. That was the mentality in Toronto in the 90s. Toronto in the 90s. That the boys in Durham wanted me to get out of. People saying immortals live in Toronto. 7,000 years plus. Even in the 2000s, I was still wondering if I was that. I talked to my friend that's now in corrections, works in Corrections Canada. Yo, is it possible I'm 7,000 years? Like, these memories are bad. Like, I have memory loss. Like, now I realize he's part of the Big Brothers of America, and he's looked out for me since the 80s because he knows I was brutalized in the 70s. And he could be a good 5 to 10 years older than me maximum. But the thing is that back in the 90s, the police that were looking for the people that were 50 years old pretended to be 60 years old. I'm willing and ready to go through those yearbooks and point out everybody I suspect was over 30 going to that school that wasn't there to protect the children that they knew were brutalized as their watchers to make sure they were safe. DM never hurt me, never sexually assaulted me. He just made sure I was safe. Same with DO and SR and a few other people that made sure I was safe, drove me to places and drove me home safe. That's what my mother always wanted. If someone can't drive me safe and drive me home because I am disabled, I wouldn't be able to speak if the cannabis wasn't in my system. Some people say I wouldn't be able to walk if the cannabis was in my system. That's what my mother and father respected. People that would show up at the house, my house, pick me up, bring me to an event, drive me back home, safe, out brutalizing me, out sexually assaulting me, because they know I'm the weakest physically in the link. So when we say anti-trans, we talk about people not being kidnapped and people not being homeless. That transgender thing didn't exist in the Americas, just like our ancestors say. That eunuch thing came up from across the ocean, and it's unscientific to cut off some people's genitalia to make them sing higher as a male. And it's unscientific to cut off a female's genitalia all rounds. Prove me wrong. I'm American Indian. Are you pushing the trans-American transit? Are you pushing the transgender agenda in America, on America, the Americas, Iceland to Australia to Patagonia in the South? If you have no American blood, no indigenous American blood, and you're pushing the transgender agenda, you've been brainwashed and duped by the Nazi Joy Division orphanage that was in Germany, where Hitler had males sexually assaulting females to breed a dedicated army that some say are all transgender. The people pushing the transgender agenda are part of the Nazi agenda. Some of them might not know it, not be aware of it. National American Man Love Boy Association, Nazis trying to sexually assault toddlers as adults, like Obi-Wan told me in 1984. Stay away from Nablum. You're a toddler. These people are grown adults that like to sexually assault children. Stay away from them. Investigate these people. And say the sexual influencers are the problem. They've kidnapped children, brainwashed them, throwing them back on society, all different informations, mixing up people's lives. When William Shakespeare said, man to man, I love you, that's sagapi. Love for family and friends, no sexuality about it. It's not eros. They're not saying, yo brother, let's be eros together. When you say childhood friend in Greek, it's pediakos philios. That sound pattern has been used in English to manipulate people that went to grammar school and they're Christian, because when you study Christianity in the true, you study it in Greek. So pediakos philios, childhood friend. pedophile in English, that term is being used to manipulate sounds in people's brains that went to grammar school that are older than me. The proper term, like they say on what's it called? SV, Special Victims Unit, child predator, a predator of children, a predator of prepubescent youth. Child predator. That's the proper term in English, not molester. Molest is another term in Greek that's been used to confuse people. Molest, I think, means now and then or something. I can't speak Greek out of my mouth every single day. I can't cognate Greek to speak it. I can't cognate French to speak it to intermediate level. Can't cognate Spanish to speak it at intermediate level. But if Spanish or French people sit around me for a week or two, I'll be speaking Spanish to them at basic to intermediate. I can't talk about nuclear physics or astronomy or science, but I could talk about them. Hey, how are you doing? This, that. What's going on? That kind of stuff. The transphobia that the media has is astronomy transphobia. People need to get educated. Get away from political science, which is no type of science at all, and understand poly-science, P-O-L-Y, from one language, which means many, or another, P-A-N, which also means many in another language. Poly or pan science, 5 or more sciences you should learn to be a scientist or technician. Then there's also the issue of Lord Pan, which is a mythical being called a faunus or a sitar, that are also bisexual. There's only 2 genders. And they create life by male and female getting together. But the difference between Pan, talking about a faunus and a sitar, that would be like Captain Kirk in Star Trek. You could say he's Pan, and he sees all these other sentient beings, and he's having sexual intercourse with the females, the ones that seem female to him. Pan could mean many in English, or a specific being. Pan, the being, the entity, is a bisexual species. Only man's male or female. Just like humans. I haven't seen no scientific proof from geneticists or scientists that if you're physically born XX, you're male. Or if you're physically born XY dominant, you're a female. Understand science and stop listening to the political scientists, because they will steer Earth into the Kali Yuga, deprivation, death, and disaster. This is Shaknogi, on the island that used to have bats, but doesn't have those bats anymore since those yahoos came here, brutalized us, my mother, my aunts, some of my uncles, and other people too, all the way until mid-70s, until we had a conference with popes and other bishops in 1978 about this and how that doesn't exist in any culture. It doesn't exist in any culture that was known in 1978. Transgenderism, it doesn't.